In 1926, a young Inuit woman climbed aboard a supply vessel headed for one of the most punishing stretches of coastline in the Arctic. Not because she wanted adventure, not because anyone told her she was brave, but because her son was dying slowly, and she needed money badly enough to say yes to something that terrified her. She was promised a short stay, a safe camp, people who would look out for her. Every one of those promises fell apart. Leah Atungala was left stranded on an ice-locked island, while the expedition around her collapsed piece by piece. She would end up fighting the Arctic alone, with almost nothing, for longer than any person should ever have to. Leah was born in 1901 in a small Inuit settlement on the northern edge of Alaska, where winter was not a season, but a permanent condition the land imposed on everything inside it. The cold up there was not the kind people in warmer places complain about. It cracked wood, froze lungs, and turned mistakes into funerals. She grew up watching her grandmother read weather the way other people read words, watching her uncles navigate sea ice with a confidence that looked like magic, until you understood it was knowledge passed down so many times it had become instinct. Her father trapped. Her mother processed skins and stored fat against the months when nothing moved outside. Leah learned the things that mattered in that world: how to stretch a hide without tearing it, how to stitch a seam tight enough that wind couldn't find the gap, how to render fat and pack it for long storage, how to read a sky that was about to turn ugly. She was not formally taught to hunt, because that wasn't how things were divided in the settlement. But she absorbed the edges of it anyway, watching and listening the way quiet people do, when they know the information might matter and can't yet say when. At 18, she married a man named Elias. He was not cruel, not particularly kind either. They had a son named Thomas, and then a second child who didn't make it past the first winter. That loss settled into her chest and stayed. Then Thomas got sick. Not sick the way children get sick and then recover. Sick in the way that in 1920s Alaska meant slow deterioration that medicine couldn't reach and love couldn't fix. Leah watched him lose weight through 2 winters and understood that watching wasn't going to be enough. Elias died in a hunting accident when Thomas was 4. After that, it was just the 2 of them in a settlement that had sympathy but not much else. She sewed for other people. She traded. She took whatever small work she could find to keep them eating and chased the treatments Thomas needed that were never quite within reach. She was not a woman who complained. She was a woman who calculated, quietly and constantly, what the next step needed to be, and then took it.
In 1926, a man named Douglas Harwick came through the settlement, recruiting for an Arctic research expedition. He needed a seamstress who could work with animal skins and repair cold weather gear. The pay was $60 a month. In that settlement, at that time, $60 was not just money. It was Thomas's treatments. It was a future that didn't end in slow defeat. Leah said yes before she fully understood what she was saying yes to. Harwick was a man of large ideas and selective honesty. He wanted to establish a permanent observation post on Kolar Island, a remote, disputed stretch of Arctic territory that various governments had been half-heartedly arguing over for years. Harwick believed presence was the same as claim. Put people on the land, raise a flag, and the argument was settled. His plan depended entirely on those people surviving long enough to matter. He recruited 5 others: James Corrigan, 22, a geology student from Boston who had never been north of Maine; Samuel Holt, 30, from Colorado, 2 seasons of trapping in Canada and carried that experience loudly; Peter Vance, 26, from Michigan, a trained radio operator sent to collect weather data; Carl Lundstrom, 31, from Minnesota, had real Arctic time behind him and the quiet competence of someone who had already learned the hard lessons. And then there was Leah. None of them meant much to her. She was not thinking about scientific goals or political implications. She was thinking about Thomas's breathing, the shallow pull of it at night, the way he looked smaller each month. She signed the papers and started packing. She almost didn't go. She was terrified of polar bears in a way that went past ordinary caution into something closer to dread. Bears that followed scent for miles, bears that came through tent walls like paper. The island was known for them. When she asked Harwick directly, he told her other Inuit families would be joining the expedition, women she would know, familiar voices. That promise mattered. She had spent her life being underestimated by men who didn't look closely. She didn't need more of that in the Arctic.
The families never showed up at the dock. Locals who had looked at the supply list and the departure date had done the math. Harwick hadn't, and wanted nothing to do with it. Leah stood on the dock alone and understood she had been misled. She tried to step back. Harwick assured her there were communities near the island. Leah's need outweighed her doubt, but only barely, and she stepped back onto the gangway with the resignation of someone choosing the lesser danger. There is a kind of bravery that doesn't announce itself. It just keeps moving, because stopping costs more than going does. The ship left in August and headed north through water that got uglier the farther it went. Storms hit them twice on the crossing, and hit them like they meant it. Gear broke loose, clothing got soaked and stayed that way. A supply crate went overboard in the second storm, taking with it a portion of food they had planned for month 4. Nobody wanted to talk yet about what that meant. The island appeared out of low gray cloud on a morning that felt like late October, which was itself a piece of information about what the winter was going to be. They landed, raised a flag, and the ship that brought them turned around and left. Leah watched it go and felt something cold settle over her that had nothing to do with temperature. The camp went up against a hillside for wind protection, reinforced with whatever they had, insulated with sod and snow blocks once the real cold arrived. A stove at the center. Leah's corner doubled as the place where food got made and gear got repaired, which meant it was never really her corner. The first weeks had a surface of normalcy. Corrigan cataloged rock samples. Holt and Lundstrom hunted with varying success. Vance sent back his weather readings on schedule. Leah cooked, repaired clothing, scraped hides, sewed new gear when old gear failed. She kept the camp running in all the ways nobody assigned to her, but everyone depended on. In the evenings, there were small moments of something like warmth. Corrigan read from a battered paperback sometimes. Vance played harmonica badly, but often. Lundstrom told stories from his previous Arctic time that were either true or invented, and gripping either way. Leah sat at the edge of these evenings, not excluded exactly, but not included in the way that would have required the men to actually see her rather than assume her. Her homesickness was a physical thing. It pushed outward at night when she was supposed to be sleeping. She thought about Thomas, whether he was eating, whether he was warm. She cried quietly and made sure no one could tell. When her sadness surfaced in ways they could see, the men were impatient. She needed to toughen up. She already was tough. They just couldn't recognize the shape of it. The bear situation was exactly as bad as she had feared. They came through camp, huge and deliberate, sniffing at supply crates. One night she lay still in the dark, listening to something massive breathe just outside the shelter, and felt the particular horror of knowing the thing had no reason to be afraid of anything on this island. One of the men eventually dealt with it, but they were not always there.
The relief ship was supposed to arrive in the summer of 1927. It didn't. Harwick had encountered funding problems and delayed the resupply by a full season from the comfort of a warm office thousands of miles away. What that meant for the people on Collar Island was that 6 months of food now had to stretch through a second winter. Their stores were already low. Hunting had been inconsistent. The math was not good, and everyone knew it, and nobody said it out loud. The second winter was a different animal entirely. The cold reached depths the first had not touched. Rationing turned meals into careful arithmetic. Signs of nutritional deficiency appeared slowly, and then faster. Gums that bled for no reason, joint pain without injury, a tiredness that sleep couldn't fix. The clinical name is scurvy, but the experience is more like watching your body renegotiate its relationship with functioning, dismantling you incrementally, while your mind stays sharp enough to document exactly how the process is going. The only real counter was fresh, raw meat, blood and organs that carried what the body needed, which meant hunting was no longer just calories. Hunting was medicine, and the men were not hunting nearly enough. Lundstrom pushed for a plan: cross the sea ice to the nearest inhabited coastline and send for rescue. The distance was brutal and the ice unstable, but the alternative was waiting in a camp running out of everything. In February, they made the attempt and failed within 12 days. Ice conditions worse than anything Lundstrom had seen before, pressure ridges they couldn't cross, open leads cutting off routes that should have worked. 2 men came back with frostbite, and everyone came back quieter than they had left. A harder plan formed in the silence after they returned. 3 would go: Corrigan, Holt, and Vance. Lundstrom was too sick. His scurvy had advanced to where serious exertion was genuinely dangerous. Leah had no training for cross-ice travel, no dogs, and was not consulted. The decision was made around her and delivered as settled fact. The 3 men would go and bring back rescue. She and Lundstrom would maintain camp and wait. What nobody said out loud was that Vance was taking the working radio with him, which meant she would have no way to reach anyone once they left. On February 14th, 1927, Corrigan, Holt, and Vance walked out of camp into white distance. Leah watched them until the landscape absorbed them, and then stood in the cold a moment longer, because going back inside meant accepting what their absence now meant. They promised 6 weeks at the outside. She kept that number in her head like a compass bearing. The next day brought a storm that erased every track they had left. Leah and Lundstrom sat with their rations and their silence and the sound of the wind, and did not say much about what it meant that the storm had come so fast after the men departed. Lundstrom's legs were getting worse. Outdoor work fell entirely to Leah. She chopped fuel and checked trap lines and hauled what needed hauling, while still frightened of carrying a rifle, while knowing bears were out there, and she was not equipped to handle one alone. She carried a long knife and moved fast, and stayed aware of her surroundings the way prey animals do, which is to say constantly and without rest.
Lundstrom was not easy company. Long-term pain makes people corrosive in a specific way, finding fault because fault is the only power available when the body has taken everything else. He criticized how she cooked, how she managed the fuel. One day she told him if he wanted to do it himself, he was welcome to try. After that, they established an armed truce that was not comfortable but was workable. She brought him raw meat when she caught it because she understood what it was doing for him medically, even when he never acknowledged it. When she caught her first fox alone, she stood in the cold holding it and felt something she couldn't quite name. Not exactly pride, something more fundamental, the confirmation that she could do this, that the skills she had absorbed at the edges of other people's expertise were real and not just observations. She processed it and added it to the food supply and did not make a thing of it, but she felt it. There were weeks when she got sick herself, a respiratory illness that made everything harder. During those weeks, the margin between surviving and not was something she could feel with her whole body. She wrote in a small journal, and in one entry she wrote instructions for what should happen to Thomas if she didn't come back. Not dramatically, practically, the way people with very little write about what very little they have. Who should take him, what she wanted him to know. Writing it down made it something she could set aside, and setting it aside made it possible to pick up the next task. Something shifted in her somewhere in the middle of that period. Not a dramatic moment, just a gradual reorganization of everything she had been told about what she could and couldn't do. She started practicing with Lundstrom's rifle. She made herself fire it until the flinch stopped and her hands steadied. She missed more than she hit at first. Then the ratio changed. The day she brought down a seabird in flight, she stood looking at it on the snow and understood she had crossed some internal line she was never going to uncross. She was no longer waiting for other people's competence. She was building her own. Spring came reluctantly, the way Arctic springs do, not as warmth but as light, more of it each day. Birds returned, eggs in the nests, seals on the ice. The island that had felt like a locked room began opening, and Leah moved through it with everything she had. She hunted. She built a raised platform so she could scan for bears and ships. She worked on a small skin boat, because a boat meant access to seals off the ice edge, and seals meant fat, and fat meant surviving another winter if it came to that. She did not want it to come to that, but she prepared anyway because preparation was the only thing she had real control over. Lundstrom did not recover. By late spring, he was spending most of his time down, legs swollen, gums dark, appetite gone. He still had opinions about how she was doing things. She let them go because she had stopped needing his approval somewhere in the middle of winter without noticing when. He died in early July.
She recorded the date because facts were what remained when everything else got stripped away. She couldn't move him far, but she built a careful structure around him to keep scavengers off. She said words over him that she thought he would have recognized. She did not know if he would have done the same for her. It didn't change what she did.
Now it was just Leah and the island. The men who had left in February were 5 months gone. The 6 weeks had run out 3 months ago. She watched the horizon every day, not because she expected to see something, but because watching was what she could do, and she was not a person who stopped doing things she could do. She killed her first seal that summer and sat next to it for a moment afterward, because that was the largest thing she had ever killed, and the patience and skill required were things she had built from nothing on this island, and she wanted to feel that for one quiet second before she got back to work. Then one morning in late August, she heard something beneath the wind that wasn't wind, a mechanical sound, distant and then less distant. She climbed to her platform and looked into fog that told her nothing. She kept looking. The sound kept coming. The fog shifted and a shape emerged from it, something with a mast, moving with purpose toward the island. Leah was off the platform and running before she finished understanding what she was seeing. She was at the surf line, waving with both arms, ready to swim if that was what it took. A small boat came off the side of the ship, a man she didn't recognize. His name was Franklin Cross, sent north by Harwick's backers after a year of delays and excuses. He had expected to find 6 people. He rode up to one woman standing in the surf, in clothing she had made herself, thinner than she should have been and steadier than she had any right to be. Leah asked about the 3 men who had left in February. Cross had no news of them. He had expected them to be here. The ice crossing they had attempted had no confirmed endpoint anyone could verify. Leah stood in the shallow, cold water and understood that the people she had been waiting for were probably not coming back. And that understanding arrived all at once and knocked the held-together thing inside her loose for the first time in months. She sat down in the surf and cried the way people cry when they have held something together so long that the holding itself was survival, and now they finally don't have to. Cross waited. He helped her to the boat when she was ready. Before the ship left, Cross's crew gave Lundstrom's remains a proper burial. Leah packed what was left of her life on the island. Her tools, her journal, the clothing she had made, the proof in every object of what she had done there. She did not look back when the ship pulled away. Back on the mainland, the story became something other people wanted to own. Newspapers ran her name under headlines that flattened her into a type, the native woman who cheated death. They described her as stoic and simple, which is what people write when they don't want to credit intelligence they weren't expecting. Others in the expedition's organization questioned whether she had done enough for Lundstrom, a question aimed exactly where questions like that are always aimed. A poor indigenous woman alone with a white man who died. It took months of careful accounting for the truth to crowd out the accusation. She had fed him, she had hauled him back to shelter when he lost consciousness. She had provided raw meat she understood was medicine, even when he never thanked her for understanding it. The accusation eventually lost traction. Accusations like that always leave marks anyway. The organization did not pay her everything she was owed. The settlement was less than the contract specified, which was common enough for people without lawyers or leverage. She took what they gave her and she went back to Thomas. That was the whole reason. That was always the entire reason. She got back to her son and she got him better care, and she watched his breathing. And for a while, that was enough to be the whole world.
Thomas improved, slowly but genuinely, in the way that the right treatment allows a sick child to grow towards something more durable. Leah had another child later, a daughter named Clara. She married again, a quieter arrangement than the first. Her life continued with the ordinary weight of ordinary days, work and cold and the accumulation of time that doesn't feel significant from the inside. She kept the journal from the island, the way you keep the thing that knows what you did when no one was watching. She lived into her late 70s and returned to the settlement of her childhood in her final years. When she died in 1979, the people who knew her real story understood what she had actually survived. Not just cold and hunger and isolation. She had survived being treated as a tool rather than a person, with a life that mattered. She had survived being left without a vote when the vote would have saved her real suffering. And then she had survived the Arctic itself, which had tried its honest best to finish what the human failures had started. The journal sits in a small archive in Alaska. The recognition that eventually came was real and decades overdue, the way recognition for women like Leah tends to arrive. What her story actually is, stripped of the headlines and the forgetting,
is a study in what a person can build when everything they were supposed to rely on turns out to be absent or useless. She did not go north because she believed in Harwick's vision. She went because Thomas needed medicine, and the Arctic paid $60 a month. She arrived without the full traditional toolkit her grandparents would have considered basic. She was dismissed and underestimated, and left with minimal equipment, no radio, and a sick partner who couldn't carry his share. And then she did what the Arctic and the people who brought her both assumed she couldn't. She paid attention. She practiced. She adapted to each failure by building something that worked. She learned to shoot because a knife wasn't going to be enough. She learned to trap because the camp food wasn't going to stretch. She learned to move through fear without letting it stop her hands. She survived not because she was extraordinary in any clean, visible way, but because she refused, consistently and without fanfare, to stop. When people asked what had kept her going, she said something simple. Thomas needed her to come home. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't packaged for anyone else's benefit. It was just the truth of what had happened inside her every morning when she had to decide whether to get up. In the Arctic, love is as practical as any tool you can carry. It keeps your legs moving when your body is sending different messages. It makes the next morning a problem with a known answer rather than a question left open. Kolar Island took many things from Leah Atungala. Her time, her safety, a portion of her health she never fully recovered. What it did not take was the thing she went there to protect. It did not take Thomas, and it did not take her. She made certain of that herself, one quiet decision at a time. If this story got inside you the way real stories sometimes do, please take a second to like the video. It helps more people find the stories that deserve to be found. And if you want to keep hearing about the people who held on when everything said let go, subscribe and stay close. There are more stories where this one came from, and every single one of them is worth your time.